This is a short overview of British literature, going chronologically, so I start at the beginning with the Anglo-Saxon epic Beowulf, written sometime between 800 and 1000, so that's in the Middle Ages, written in Old English, the Anglo-Saxon language. Oh, and by the way, it's about kind of Viking warrior fighting monsters, so it's a very great epic from that era. While the Canterbury Tales is a collection of short stories by Geoffrey Chaucer from the later Middle Ages, written in Middle English. While William Shakespeare is the famous playwright who wrote his plays and poems called sonnets at the end of the 1500s and the beginning of the 1600s, including the plays Hamlet and Romeo and Juliet, Macbeth and King Lear, and many more very famous plays. John Milton is a major poet from the 1600s. He wrote an epic poem called Paradise Lost. An epic poem means that it's almost like a novel. It's a long story, but written so that it rhymes. And this one was about Lucifer, the devil, and the first Genesis story, that he as a fallen angel, which isn't actually in the Bible, but a lot of people think it is, probably because of Paradise Lost. Daniel Defoe wrote Robinson Crusoe as a fake traveler's tale. It was tricked out to seem like it was, in fact, a real or true story when it was not. And it is a very popular novel from as far back as 1719. Another old one is Jonathan Swift's Gulliver Travels, which was a parody of Traveler's Tales and really an early effort to write fantasy. And the Romantic period of romantic poets like William Wordsworth, John Keats, and Lord Byron, was between 1798 and 1819, about those years when several of these very famous poets were active. But there's more romantic literature. Jane Austen, very famous, of course, wrote several books, most famously Sense and Sensibility and Pride and Prejudice. Charles Dickens lived in the Victorian era. He wrote Oliver Twist as a social criticism in 1837. He was very young back then. He has also written many books that are famous, including Great Expectations. And there's a genre called Gothic horror, famous for the novels Frankenstein and Dracula, sort of monster novels. There's also something called Gothic fiction, which does not include monsters, but has sort of the same psychological underlying terror or something there that makes it more enticing or mysterious. But it can also be romantic. And famous novels here by the Bronte sisters. Charlotte Bronte wrote Jane Eyre, and Emily Bronte wrote Wuthering Heights. In the same year, no less, 1847. Oscar Wilde is another author of Gothic fiction. He was Irish, a very famous author. He wrote The Picture of Dorian Gray, which came out in 1890, which is about a young man who lives a very debaucherous lifestyle, but he retains his good looks while there's a picture of him, a painting in an attic somewhere of him, and the picture, the image of him in the picture, slowly disintegrates and sort of shows the physical image of his actual lifestyle, which is very self-destructive. Going from the late 19th century to the present now, there was detective fiction with the Sherlock Holmes series by Arthur Conan Doyle. The first one was from 1887. The most famous one is The Hound of the Baskervilles, which is a Sherlock Holmes novel, published a little later than that. And the science fiction, the groundbreaking science fiction novels of H.G. Wells, which he started writing in the 1890s and continued after 1900. For instance, The Time Machine or The Invisible Man, The Island of Dr. Moreau, which is about animal-human hybrids and genetic engineering, really, and The War of the World, which is about invading Martians who try to conquer the Earth. The Irish playwright George Bernard Shaw wrote Pygmalion, which is more famous for the title of its movie adaptation called My Fair Lady, about a professor, a British high-class person who finds this Cockney-speaking young maid or something and tries to teach her to become a proper lady and speak proper English. And there was something called modernism, which was based on stream of consciousness, a sort of a technique, literary technique from the 1920s. James Joyce, who was also Irish, and Virginia Woolf, the two most famous examples of modernism, with their novels Ulysses and Mrs. Dalloway. And Mrs. Dalloway, for instance, it's a novel, takes place in only one day, and is based mostly on stream of consciousness of her hearing this woman's inner monologue. And the novels of James Joyce can be very difficult to read and understand what's happening. So that's modernism. The dystopian novels of George Orwell are very well known. He wrote Animal Farm, which is kind of an allegory of the Russian Revolution, where these animals revolt on their farm and take over the farm, but the leaders create another dictatorship of their own. 1984 is another novel which is very famous for its terminology. He used words there like Big Brother and Newspeak and other ones which have also come into our language and have this dystopian feel. That dystopia is the opposite of utopia. So these are that's a sort of a place that is terrible, whereas utopia is a place that is perfect. John Ronald Reuel Tolkien wrote The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, is the most famous example of fantasy literature that has come out of Britain, unless you count J.K. Rowling's Harry Potter series. And J.K. Rowling must be the most successful author ever, I think, in history. Anyway, thanks for watching. Hope you enjoyed it, and catch my other videos if you haven't already.